Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about what I am doing these days with chains and with bands and how I use them as a replacement for not only dumbbells, but in many ways it gives me more tools at my disposal than I would have even if I had a full rack of dumbbells. Now, a lot of people look at this and be like, well, I don't understand. Well, most serious powerlifters or most strength and conditioning gyms and things like that already have bands and chains, and I already have 130 pounds of chains, right? So that's the equivalent of up to a 65-pound dumbbell. Now, I can do other stuff with those. Obviously, they're there to attach to bars primarily, but you can do a lot with that. Same thing with the bands. I mean, I have a full Rogue band set. And some of those individual bands, even at normal tensions, go up to 50 pounds each, but you can do them in multiples, and when you run them certain ways, they go higher. Like if I use those black bands over a deadlift bar, I've measured them, they give me 150 pounds of tension, the top of a deadlift. But you could run other bands across with that. I could easily create 300 pounds of band tension that way. So what is it that they bring to the table? Well, what they do is that they give me all the freedom of movement that you would get with dumbbells as far as independent sides, being able to clear your body, things like that, and a lot of the little smaller exercises that people do. When you think about it, we're generally doing a lot of these smaller exercises for certain ranges of motion, trying to get a certain stretch reflex. Things like that we might be missing on our big lifts, and usually to put in extra workload into a smaller muscle group. And I don't care what it is that you're training for. Like, watch me do the tricep extensions right there. Now, a lot of people who are chasing bigger triceps might look at that and go, man, that's fantastic. That might really bring my triceps up. And actually, it's phenomenal. It's a totally different feeling in your triceps with those chains. But it's a bench press specific exercise, because a lot of times we can only do so much chest pressing before our pec tendons can't handle anymore, our shoulders get beat up, things like that, right? And we still need more tricep specific training. And so if you look at the angles involved, this actually has good carryover to the bench press. But the point is that I'm using these chains to do it, and it creates a contrast weight, right? When you're using dumbbells, you're stuck with a specific weight. With the chains as a perfect example, there's a lot of exercises to where you can have a more even loading through the strength curve. In other words, a lot of times we're stronger near the top of like a tricep extension like that than at the bottom. And sometimes the bottom is where we get the tendonitis tends to develop. And so if you just reduce the weight a little bit there and you put more focus on the top, you can possibly recruit more total muscle fibers while still getting a very pronounced range of motion. And that actually hits all three heads. But it has a unique feel to it. Same thing, you take a lot of these side laterals that I'm doing. Right, lateral raises. Well, we know the bottom doesn't hit the side deltas much. A lot of times if you're doing a lateral, why are we doing these? We're doing them because we need bigger delts. And oftentimes the lateral head of the delt is the one that tends to lag the most. It tends to lag for a lot of people. Well, same thing with this. You can do these in such a way to where you're working that and the posterior head slightly more. You're skipping the bottom more or less, or not skipping it so much as you're just reducing the load where it doesn't matter as much. And you're then putting the most mechanical tension through the points where that muscle is going into peak contraction. Now, obviously, things like this is more of a finesse movement. This is not intended to build overall size through your whole body like a big exercise is. But if we're going to do these smaller movements, we can be thinking in terms of what's efficient here. Well, you would look at something like this and go, well, this does just as much as dumbbells, really. But it also creates an interesting novel training response because the swing of the chains gives a little bit more pull on the way down. Same thing, look at these tricep extensions I'm doing with the band, right? It's putting it into that stretch position at the top. But what is it that bands and stuff bring to the table? Well, they give you the ability to create overspeed eccentrics. People would say, well, why does that matter? Well, if you think about it, a lot of times when we're chasing hypertrophy, there is data that eccentric loading can have certain benefits to hypertrophy. It can be harder to recover from, can have more micro tears. But where a lot of bodybuilders and those guys mess up, and I'm not saying that bodybuilders don't get jacked, they do, but it's usually just because they're training plus using copious amounts of substances and things like that. But if we're going to think in terms of eccentric loading, really faster eccentrics with a heavier load against them are going to create a larger eccentric response in the body. So a lot of times bands, particularly on an exercise like this, it puts the long head into a stretch position. When you stretch and then have the band go against any sort of speed, what happens? When the band jerks back, it creates a much, much larger eccentric effect than you would get with a normal weight. So things like bands like this, and it's one of the reasons we use them on barbells for powerlifting, is what? The eccentric overloading effect it gives. It can give overspeed eccentrics. Well, if you've got a lagging muscle, and in my case, like my arms are always lagging muscles. Even for me as a lifter, everyone still has always said, oh, you got small arms. But since I've been incorporating a lot of these methods and programming them, again, this is not, you don't just throw mindless volume. I'm seeing a bit of extra arm growth. Same thing, you get the same effect on a lateral. Now you're looking at it going, you aren't getting much at the bottom at all, and it doesn't matter, because if you're rotating through these in different training days and phases, something like this, you're creating an overspeed eccentric because the band jerks it back down at the point of maximum mechanical tension on that side lateral. Now, if you did a lift like this with just bands, it's actually going to give you less total hypertrophy in other areas. It's not a good all-around size builder. But if you do have that head of the muscle that's lagging, this is going to be more effective than a dumbbell for every rep that you do, right? Because we're getting that additional eccentric loading. The only downside is that when you train, if you were to train exclusively with bands, you're going to have recovery issues. You are going to have problems with overall development and certain antagonist muscle groups and things. Like I would never recommend you train exclusively with bands, right? But for a lot of things, they have an enormous benefit. And so when we're dealing with a lot of these band exercises, what are we doing? We're able to, if we pick our exercises carefully, we can take a lot of lagging muscles or muscles we need to bring up and create an enormous eccentric loading effect. And all this stuff can be done independently. It can load, and if you think carefully through and look at different joint angles and what you're doing, you can take the chains and the bands and everything else, and you can come up with exercise variations that will replace a lot of these smaller fluff exercises that people do, and actually do things like maximize tension on them at certain points, create larger eccentric effects and eccentric overloading and overspeed eccentrics. All right, so what we're really doing is, in a lot of ways, optimizing some of the smaller exercises. Now, a lot of people would say, well, I don't know, this doesn't bring much more to the table than dumbbells, I don't feel. And hey, you could have that perspective, because people could argue, well, you could still reach a certain amount of tension and workload with dumbbells. But the difference here is that with a lot of these, you can create a lot of angles to where you put less stress on tendons and things in ways that cause tendonitis, things that cause overuse injuries. And that's really what it comes down to. In other words, if you do endless sets of curls or endless sets of tricep extensions with just normal weight in many environments, you end up with tendonitis. That's the downside to smaller exercises. With a lot of this, we can change strength curves in such a way to where we don't rub tendons in those ways. We don't cause that sort of irritation and stuff in the connective tissue. Or because we do the heavier eccentric loaded stuff, we get a larger response for every rep, and we can end up doing a little less volume. You do a little less total volume sometimes, because it's not going to be, not as much as going to be always necessary, because again, that eccentric overloading effect has its own hypertrophic response. And so what this allows for is, again, maximizing doing some of these smaller movements. And when you think about it, think of it in terms of cost. Yes, I have hundreds of dollars invested in bands and chains, but compare that to the space that a dumbbell rack takes up, or the cost of dumbbells. Right? The cost of dumbbells in comparison is pretty staggering. Whereas this, I just have all my chains piled up in the corner if I want. All my bands hang on a band hook. It uses very little space, and these are multifaceted tools, because the bands and the chains are also used for other stuff, right? They're used for various powerlifting movements and accommodating resistance and speed work when hooked to barbells. So that's the point we have here, is that this gives a lot of versatility, because these are tools that we already use enormously on barbells and strength and conditioning and in powerlifting. we're oftentimes going to have them already for all these other really, really effective uses. And if you've already got them, you can be creative in their use and do the same thing if you're very careful in your exercise selection for the smaller movements. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.